My mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
Folks have heard me remark on phrases that were put out there by Frederick Douglass. And if you don't know who Frederick Douglass is, shame on you. You should know. Frederick Douglass was a slave before the Civil War. He did a number of very influential writings that led to, at that time, the creation of the Republican Party, which was an abolitionist party, and the destruction of the Whig Party, and which led to, of course, the election of Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. He said a lot of things out there, like the difference between a free man and a slave is whether or not he's allowed by law to own a gun. And I look at that and I'm like, okay, I got you. I'm with you. I hear you. Because, of course, slaves were not allowed to own weapons of any kind, but yet free men were. In this short thing, he says, a man's rights rest in 3 boxes. Number 1, the ballot box. And of course, that's self-evident, right? Number 2, the jury box, because you need to be there in order to adjudicate whether or not something is lawful or not. And number 3, the cartridge box. And of course, a cartridge box means where you keep your bullets. And in that, he's talking about whether or not the government can be trusted to do what's right. Because if you remember, slavery was lawful. Now, I won't go into the whole reasons why, but the British, of course, allowed for slavery to exist in their colonial empire. But each of the colonies here in North America was allowed to determine whether or not slavery was allowed. And most of them in the 1600s had passed laws stating that they did not want the practice of slavery to exist. Both north and south of the what became the Mason-Dixon line had laws on the books that made slavery illegal. And in fact, it was a lawsuit by a black gentleman who moved from Africa to the U.S. and brought his slaves that he had purchased in Africa with him. I believe he had like half a dozen slaves. And he sued the colony of Virginia to allow him to keep his slaves, because they told him that he had to convert his slaves either to freedmen or to indentured servants, which was allowed. And he refused. And so he got a lawyer, and he sued the state of Virginia because since they were his property, quote unquote, prior to moving to Virginia, how could Virginia, the colony of Virginia, deprive him of slaves when the British Empire allowed slavery to exist? He won his case and was allowed to keep his slaves, which then was followed up by other lawsuits, eventually leading to the colony of Virginia having to give up on the laws that it had on the books outlawing slavery, which then, of course, became part of the common law of the colonies, and of course into the United States, original 13 colonies. Once they won independence, most of the British laws carried forward, and that was one of them, even though Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, James Madison, and many of the other founding fathers wanted to eliminate slavery, but were not allowed to do so. It's one of the big things that frustrates me about, you can hear the waves run up on shore right now. Got a little breeze that kicked in. Very nice, actually. But it's one of the things that frustrates me about those who do not know history. And they're out there saying, oh, we need to pull down these statues of the founding fathers because they were slaveholders. Many of them were. And if you look back, you find out that most of them inherited the slaves that existed on their plantation, and either in their lifetimes or on their deathbed, turned their slaves into freedmen, George Washington being one of them. Jefferson being another, although his family sued his estate because he was in debt to them, and they said that he should not have been allowed to dispose of property prior to settling his debts. So remember, slavery existed everywhere in the world at the time, and Frederick Douglass came up in the time of slavery in the new United States and fought against slavery. That's why he was such a big proponent of free men to be able to protect themselves. So I'll leave it at that. You think about it from that perspective. It's the reason why the Second Amendment, of course, was put into the Bill of Rights, because it was assumed that eventually our own government would become so overwhelming and consume so many of the rights and powers of the people that the people would become literal slaves. But not if they were an armed populace. So think about those things, and whether you think they're right or not. Is Frederick Douglass on point here, where he says that there's 3 boxes that hold men's rights: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. I'll leave it at that. Chat with you later. Bye.